Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name's Chad Evans. Hi, Deborah.
Just me.
Join us. I'm Executive Vice President of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness, and I'm really honored to be here this morning in this opening conversation where we will be engaging and hearing from an incredible slate of leaders who are going to share their perspectives on just how do we accelerate and amplify America's innovation capacity, America's innovation capabilities and potential. So joining me today, we have Foutty, the Business Vice Chair for the U.S. Council on Competitiveness and the Executive Chair of the Board of Deloitte. Foutty, Joan Gabel.
Two women, I'd like to acknowledge that 3 women actually on stage today, so we have to celebrate that as well.
Our little glitches when we got up on stage, right?
All good.
Joan Gabel, the President of the University of Minnesota and our Academic Vice Chair, and Thom Mason. Thom is the President and CEO of Triad National Security. He's also the Director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and 3 of them, along with Brian Moynihan, co-lead our National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. And rounding out the panel, we have Erwin Gianchandani. Erwin is the Assistant Director of the National Science Foundation and its new Director, and we'll talk about that in a bit more, but Deborah foreshadowed that, and of course, our President and CEO, the Honorable Deborah Wince-Smith. The Council's National Commission that Deborah referenced in her opening remarks really found its roots in 2 seminal Council initiatives over the past decade. One was important path-breaking work we undertook with Gallup, where we really analyzed and began to understand the multi-decadal and structural decline of U.S. productivity growth, the challenges that meant for U.S. long-term competitiveness. And the second major initiative, which informed our National Commission, was actually work we undertook with the National Science Foundation. And that was an initiative we called Exploring Innovation Frontiers, where we began to examine not only challenges, but even some opportunities and best practices that were emerging across the country in areas that were perhaps underrepresented or underengaged in our national innovation conversation. And so, driven by those 2 initiatives, as well as the incredible findings from the COVID-19 pandemic round, if our ability to scale and scope out innovation potential very quickly, that really emboldened our National Commission to make its first set of recommendations that Deborah referenced in December 2020, where we call for a 10x, a 10-fold increase, not only in the speed at which we innovate, but a 10-fold increase in the number of Americans who are involved and engaged in our innovation economy. And in many cases, we've seen incredible transformations already. Deborah has documented some of those. We're beginning to see what we hope are transformational new investments in federal R&D spending. We're seeing new strategies to secure U.S. leadership in critical technologies. And of course, we're beginning to see new efforts to engage more Americans in innovation and entrepreneurship. Now, the hope is, of course, that these new investments will bring new technologies to the marketplace, will create new jobs, will drive future economic and productivity growth for the country, and of course, have a positive impact upon our competitiveness in an increasingly globalized innovation system. And so we're going to talk about all of these issues today, and in particular, are we actually prepared today for this distinctive moment? And Janet, I'm wondering if I could turn to you first. From your perspective at Deloitte, where you are scanning hundreds, if not thousands, of companies across not only the United States, but around the world, how's business responding? Is business ready for this moment? And I think coupled to that, are there things that the public sector and the government can do better to empower our private sector?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chad, and it's truly a pleasure to be here with you all having this conversation. It's great to be back in person as well, to recognize and celebrate that. I want to start this conversation by framing that I think we have to be focused on the fact that the historical roles are changing. I think it's really important that each of our types of organization is not bound by how we think about our roles and responsibilities historically. When you think about business evolving past just product development, academia beyond research, the government beyond just funding, to standard setting, and bringing together disparate entities to focus. I think that's a really important lens that the business community is really focused on, is making sure that we're not constrained by our traditional boundaries. And that, to me, sort of sits at the epicenter of how I really think about this conversation. There's no doubt that the government funding, and we've talked actually a lot about that last evening and this morning, certainly has the business community's attention in a really, really big way. And the business community views it as really strong signals as where to double down on investments, both within the organization as well as in the workforce. And I know we're going to talk a lot about the workforce in the conversation today, but there's no doubt very high focus, attention, and enthusiasm, while also anxiously waiting for, and I'll just use CHIPS Plus as an example, for the next level of click down in terms of how to make sure that we're responding in a manner that really responds to the direction that the government is setting, both in terms of technology, policy, and innovation broadly. I think the role of government being more than just a funding mechanism actually is very valued by the business community writ large. And here I'll speak more about the US. I don't have as much of a purview outside of the US to that topic in particular. But this idea of government as convener and looking more broadly at the ecosystem sits, I think, very much positively for the business community. But there's a few things that I want to focus on that I think government can do that can make a really big difference. The first is to be very outcomes focused and have really clear ambition in terms of the outcome. The second is not looking for a single solution. You all know probably better than I that it's no one technology, no one organization, no one idea that's going to bring the next level of innovation. And over the course of my career, certainly what I've seen, especially accelerated over the last sets of years, is the business community understanding much more how important that collaboration is. And the third I would highlight is that the government really needs to be focused on the official word, I guess, is transition and managing the transitions and paying attention, but I think of it as minding the gap in my simple vocabulary and vernacular, the place where innovation can absolutely get stuttered or stopped is in the transitions between each of the organizations, and to really up the attention and focus on those transition points. I very briefly mentioned talent. The business community does feel, I feel for the first time, obviously in conjunction with labor in the places where labor works closely with business on the future of work and the future of talent. And Deborah knows she can always sort of wind me up to talk about this, and I won't dominate the discussion by it today. But I think the business community fundamentally understands the importance of its role in both the investment in and the development of the future generations of talent vis-a-vis this innovation. I'm thrilled that we actually have the community college conversation represented, I think, for the first time here today, and our partnership with academia to really think about how do we develop the next generation of our workforce. And maybe I'll just close quickly where I started, which is that I think our acknowledgement of the role shifts is what is critical as we think about avoiding the ever understood sort of valley of despair when we look from innovation to commercialization and competitiveness. And so those are a few of my thoughts through the lens of the things that I'm seeing today that hopefully we'll be able to pull the threads on through the rest of our conversation today.
No, thanks, Janet. Well, there's a lot there. Joan, one of the things I think I heard from Janet is this criticality of osmosis. And of course, the university community, you live that, our community colleges live that. You're bridging disciplines, you're bridging domains, just like, as Janet described, that the business community is doing. And I'm wondering in that context, as you also look at what we hope will be massively significant new funding in STEM and R&D for our universities and community colleges, how's the University of Minnesota responding? How ought our academic community here respond to that for this moment? And are you prepared? And what are some of the exciting opportunities you see coming down?
Well, thank you for that, Chet. So I'll add my appreciation for being here with all of you in person, and also say that there are a lot of other university presidents in the room, so I'm very happy to share my perspective, and of course then very much look forward to hearing from my colleagues. But I want to actually do, even though I absolutely agree with what Janet said about how we have to really disengage from historical constraints and think about new ways of working together in order to avoid the things that have made us stutter in the past, or to even meet the moment looking towards the future. Just a tiny bit of context. There's a recent report from Autumn. Autumn is the professional association for our tech transfer people that estimates that over the past 25 years, the licensing of academic patents specifically has contributed $1.9 trillion to the US economy and supported the creation of around 6.5 million jobs. And that was before, when we were in lanes and working in a rather linear way, we still accomplished that much. And so there can be this very high temptation of it ain't broke kind of mindset, even with all of the things that we've gone through. And in order to break out of that, I think we have to do exactly what Janet has described and think of it from the education side of things and looking out in the way that she has ideated for us or started a conversation for us. The university environment is changing a lot, just like everything else. We've been through a very transformational time these last few years. There are silver linings amidst what was, I will say, an extremely unpleasant experience for most of us, in that we know and have a recognized and widened appetite for doing things in ways that we would have never considered before. One of the most obvious, of course, being the way in which we're delivering instruction. And we can't remove that from the conversation when we talk about talent development and what that can mean for partnerships. But if you really want to catalyze the higher ed community, and I think you do, in a very self-serving way, but also in a realistic way, the way that history has taught us, then we have to think about what it takes to move this group of people, this type of community forward. And I think that that comes from a lot of support. A lot of people in higher education did not necessarily come to higher education in order to be innovators necessarily. No one comes in thinking they don't want to be, but it may not have been the primary incentive or focus. So there needs to be a supportive environment to spread your wings as a thinker, as a scholar, even as a student. I think there need to be incentives. Now, the new rounds of federal funding bake in a lot of those incentives. Some of those go to the innovator themselves. Some of those go to insisting that we work in interdisciplinary ways, that we work with new partnerships that we might not have considered before. Both of those together, creating incentives. And then there has to be a reward structure, I think, that goes beyond money. I think this is one of the things that is somewhat idiosyncratic about the higher ed environment. Nobody minds being paid for their success, but it is not necessarily the primary motivator in a scholarly environment. It needs to be awarded, rewarded in the ways that create recognition amongst a scholarly community if you want to see the kind of attention towards it that would lead to the kind of innovation that we can then think about translating. But I want to talk for just a second about that translation, because I do think that the federal government has become a much more focused and intentional partner in encouraging higher ed innovation to be translatable. And we could list, I'm going to let my colleague to my left list all of the dozens of ways that the federal agencies have created this. We all feel it very much on campus. But that process for a faculty member or a student or staff, for that matter, in partnership with the business community, in partnership with the national labs, et cetera, often needs to come back to knowing that they have agency and ownership in what it is they ideate and create. And that is relatively new. So the idea of really circling back to that and ensuring that we're thinking about that while we all work for the greater good, and this is part of a bigger picture set of possibilities and competitiveness for who we are and what we are, that if you're going to ask someone to choose between spending their time on one thing or the other, there has to be some sort of sense of ownership, if not actual ownership, in what it is they create. And I think if we think about those incentives, that support, that reward, the right partnerships, I think you'll see higher ed really leaning in even more than history would tell us we already have.
Thanks, Jonah. And Thom, maybe you can jump in here and maybe riffing on this idea of perhaps a moment of greater intentionality that we're seeing from the public sector. So the National Lab Enterprise is not going to be left out of this conversation around transformational investments in basic research and science. So I'm wondering if you can share with us your thinking around, yes, what Los Alamos is doing, perhaps even share your perspective on the broader National Laboratory Enterprise on how you're responding to this moment. Are you doing more with business? Are you doing more with academia? What's the landscape looking like as you look into 2023 and beyond?
Yeah, I think all of the labs are in a process of really ramping up their engagement, in response to what has been a kind of remarkable period in terms of putting in place some of the building blocks of a competitive national response. If you look at the things that Deborah talked about in her remarks, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Acts, the Inflation Reduction Acts, taken together, it does represent a pretty significant mobilization against the needs for innovation, the needs for research leadership, the needs for clean energy transformation, and the labs can play a role. Just to give you a couple examples, Deborah mentioned that there was an announcement recently by Secretary Granholm and President Biden about the research infrastructure investments, the $1.5 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. That money is already allocated. The labs are investing, upgrading their user facilities, upgrading facilities for the production of medical isotopes to support clinical trials. And so if you're an NIH researcher or a pharmaceutical company trying to develop new therapeutics for cancer, you need the isotopes, and those are the kind of facilities that are being invested in, enabled by that funding. In terms of the clean energy portfolio, there is a lot of investment focused on deployment and carbon management. And so, for example, in our part of the country, the Intermountain West, there's a lot of interest in what can be done in the Four Corners region, where there's an energy transition going on associated with coal plants and coal mines, actually, in the Navajo Nation. And there's an economic dislocation associated with that, but there's also an economic opportunity associated with the future of carbon management, and that's something that we're hoping we can facilitate. And you see examples like that all across the country. The third piece, of course, is CHIPS and Science, and in that case, we're not fully mobilized yet, and the reason is because although there's investment on the CHIPS side of CHIPS and Science, the science side of CHIPS and Science, there's still work to be done. So I think our pencils are sharp, and I know our colleagues in the universities are sharpening their pencils to respond to the competitive research opportunities that may emerge, but we've got a little bit more work to do to bring that one to fruition.
Yeah, I think that's something, well, obviously, and Deborah can weigh in here, the council is very focused on. We need to ensure that that happens. But Thom, maybe to bridge to Deborah, I want to raise a point that I've heard you mention in the past. Yes, this group is about U.S. competitiveness, but we know U.S. competitiveness exists in a global context. And you've often made the point that to be nationally competitive and to have the best national innovation competitive ecosystem, we have to continue to engage globally and not retrench, not pull back. Can you just maybe say a few words there? And then Deborah, I'd love for you to weigh in around our National Commission's recommendation around technology statecraft, and we'll come back to the U.S. ecosystem towards the end, but and of course, I'd love for others to weigh in here too.
So yeah, I think it's a very important point. In fact, if you go to the National Academy's website, there is now posted a draft report called, make sure I get this right, Protecting the U.S. Technological Advantage. And this is a report from a committee that was co-chaired by Pat Gallagher, the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, and Sue Gordon, the former Deputy Director for National Intelligence. And it's a very interesting framing because the starting point for the discussion was protecting U.S. technology, which has been a big topic of discussion. You can see elements of CHIPS and Science, for example, that are focused on protecting technology. And that's clearly important. No one wants to have their ideas stolen. No one wants to have their intellectual property stolen. It's important that we protect our technology. But what this National Academy report does is it actually, I think, elevates that discussion to say, yes, it's important to protect our technologies, but it's most important to protect our technological advantage, which includes our technologies. Right. It also includes the scientific and engineering leadership to develop new technologies. And it also includes, I think, one of our elements of technological advantage is smart cooperation. And that openness of our research enterprise, the ability to compete, yes, but also cooperate internationally with partners who share our objectives and are willing to share in the results, allows us to go faster. And I think that's something that we have to be careful to preserve and nurture. It can be, I think, tempting to sort of say, well, if we're making all these big public investments, the U.S. taxpayer wants some assurance that they will get the benefits of those public investments. And so, we need to make sure that we're being smart about how we collaborate. But I think it is actually part of our technological advantage.
Deborah, Janet, maybe you want to jump in.
Can I just do one line add on there, which will not be from maybe quite as sophisticated a lens, but from a business perspective, when I think about our client portfolio, most of our clients are global in nature and expect to be served with the same discipline and rigor and sophistication that they're served in the US around the globe. So your language about protect and nurture and actually help build, more than nurture, but help build when you think about not the underlying engineering capabilities, but the broad technology, pedigree, and sophistication around the globe is critical. And then alliances as well. I think about all the innovation work that's happening in Israel, for example, right now. That those alliances and relationships are critical to still maintain when we think about the success of American companies and U.S. competitiveness.
Deborah, I don't know if you want to jump
Well,
in.
a theme so far in our discussion, of course, is about partnerships and working together. And, if you look at our history as Americans, there have been a few times when we've looked inside, but we are a people that look outward. And I think those who have that mindset want to collaborate, they want to engage, and we have a great, great history of transforming not just our own country, but the world through cooperation in business, yes, in academia, but also in civil society. So that is something I think that going forward, in an environment where there's so many global challenges that we have to work on together, we will continue to embrace and be a leader on. But at the same time, at this threshold of these disruptive technologies that are absolutely changing the world in warp speed, obviously AI and quantum and genomics, hypersonics, the list goes on, we have to be very mindful that our competitors, both economically and from a national strategic viewpoint, and I'm speaking of China, but also Russia and others, see access and leadership in those technologies as absolutely critical to their global ambitions. President Xi has said, whoever leads the world in AI and quantum will control the world. So we have to be mindful in some of these very complex strategic R&D partnerships of working with those countries who, yes, have the assets and capabilities. For instance, our big partnership the Council has through our CTOs with Australia is very strategic. They're one of the leaders in the world in quantum platforms. We want to work with them. Similarly with Japan. How can you work in next generation advanced semiconductors without working with Japan and Korea, et cetera? So technology statecraft really needs to be thought out of as, yes, a platform for understanding what are the challenges and opportunities, but being, and I love your language, smart collaboration, how we do that to ensure at the end of the day that we have those capabilities to propel our economy, our job creation, a great workforce, but also our national security. And of course, as we continue to see the invasion of Russia and Ukraine and the advantages that occur on the battlefield from strategic technologies, we know that these things are all merged together in a way that we have to be very mindful of. So turning, and I do also want to mention, I mentioned this last night, but the Council's very proud of our over 10-year now leadership in creating the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils that now has some 25 countries as members, all 7 continents. We just met recently in Athens on place-based innovation. And that's a group of leaders who all care about building their competitiveness in their own economies, but they want to work together, they want to share, and they want to do it for the benefit of mankind as well as their own nations. And so that's another platform for smart strategic collaboration. On place-based innovation, this is a back to the future story for the Council on Competitiveness, because we were the organization back in the late 90s with one of our founders, Michael Porter, you all know at Harvard, who really created the whole thought leadership around regional clusters of innovation. Even that, language came out of the Council. We joke we created a huge cottage industry of consultants running around the world, how to identify clusters and what are your assets and strengths. But we studied San Diego and Atlanta and Research Triangle Park and Wichita. We saw what was going on to make those economies build on their strengths, but transform. But now, fast forward, we have a situation in our country where we have great centers of innovation, obviously on the West Coast, Silicon Valley, the East Coast, Chicago, Austin, other parts, but we have left too many Americans out of the innovation game and the innovation future. It's a fundamental recommendation in our 10X strategy. And so going forward, a very, very important anchor of our work is to engage all of these parts of the country to, yes, build capacity and capability, but very importantly, link them in to the strategic partnerships that will be funded by the government, Department of Agency, NSF. We are very proud. We have a new strong membership of historically Black colleges and universities. We're going to speak later today with the Deputy Director of the White House HBCU initiative, and of course soon with our colleague Erwin from NSF. But we all have to recognize universities are throughout our country. We have companies, and we need to ensure that all Americans are going to have the skills, the capacity, and the infrastructure to be innovators. And I just want to close because our former chair, your predecessor, Joan, Michael Crow, who played a very important role in the council and creating the National Innovation Commission, said, if you think of the United States as a baseball team or a football team, whatever sport you want, you know, we're only fielding less than 10% of the players on the field, and we got to get the others. And so that is really critical for place-based innovation and for the partnerships that will make that happen.
Thanks, Deborah. And Erwin, let's rope you in here. We're pivoting back to the domestic scene. You know, Deborah's obviously painted the picture that how the U.S. Council is beginning to think about a new demography, a new geography of innovation. You're leading the instantiation of a new directorate at NSF, the first in 30 years. It's a big job, and it's all about technology, innovation, and partnerships. So I wonder if you can share a little bit about your vision. How does it relate to U.S. competitiveness? And maybe even if you could share your thoughts on success metrics, 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, how will we know TIPS is making a difference? And then I really want to open it up to the panel in our remaining minutes to chime in with some final thoughts on the look forward for 2023. But Erwin, please.
Sure. So first of all, thanks very much for having me, Chad, and it's great to be here, great to be in person, and as I scan the room, great to see familiar faces, folks I've talked with over the course of the last year or two about the TIP Directorate and our plans and so forth. So for some of you, this will be some that you've heard, but also some new things as well. So you know, I'm going to turn a little bit what Deborah said just a moment ago. On the flip side, you know, we're only fielding about 10% of the nation at any given time in the STEM enterprise, and actually flip it to say the following. America's competitive advantage is in fact our diversity. It is in fact the diverse talent, the diverse geography, the diverse perspectives that we have all across the country. And that manifests in terms of some of the fundamental challenges that we face. If you think about climate change, it looks very different in different parts of the country, and we can learn a lot from that. If you look at issues of equity and inequities that have become so manifest over the course of the last couple of years with the pandemic and so forth, whether it be access to healthcare or education or broadband connectivity, a basic currency of data and information today. And so I think that in many ways, these fundamental challenges that we face, coupled with the fact that all across the world, all around the world, we see this pressing push to try to accelerate technological progress in AI and quantum and semiconductors and supply chains and so forth. That together in many ways creates this sort of defining moment. It's a defining moment that the board of the National Science Foundation, the National Science Board has talked about. It's a defining moment that our director, who was speaking a few minutes ago, has talked about. And it leads us to say, well, if we're going to really tackle these issues, we need to be getting everyone on that baseball diamond. We need to be ensuring that we are going to every corner of the country, and we are creating opportunities for everyone to be able to engage. And in particular, you know, I think one of the key phrases that we've been using of late is meet people where they are. right? That's why I'm so excited to hear about this conversation around community colleges this morning, right? And minority serving institutions, HBCUs, HSIs, tribal colleges and universities as well. I think it's incumbent upon us to create pathways for folks from all these different backgrounds to find their way into STEM. Anybody can be excited about STEM, if only we can create the pathways for them to be excited about STEM, and such that we can then harness that demography and geography of innovation. And so what we're trying to do with the Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate is to really seize upon the great words that my colleagues on this panel have already articulated this morning. I think many of you are familiar with the flagship investment that we have around NSF's regional innovation engines, which is really about trying to create that framework and trying to provide the resourcing to be able to allow communities and regions across the country that have their own specialized foci. You know, you mentioned, let's not pick a particular topic area, right? Because there's the need for advancement in all of these areas. Well, different parts of the country are going to have sort of clusters of individuals and organizations that are loosely connected today, but focusing in on minerals or focusing in on materials or focusing in on agriculture. And here's an opportunity for us to be able to provide the framework as well as the resourcing to be able to allow those more loosely connected constituents to become much more tightly integrated through partnership, through collaboration, to create the workforce pathways, but to also give rise to the new technological outputs that we really want to see manifest. And so the engines program, you know, we're talking about potentially up to $160 million per engine over a 10-year horizon to be able to deliver on this vision, which is an order of magnitude removed from what NSF has traditionally done, even in our largest investments, our science and technology centers, our engineering research centers. And it's because that's what we feel it's going to take to be able to uplift and to provide those opportunities in the different parts of the country. I think the key point, though, that I will say is, you know, our goal should not be, cannot be, that every part of the country is going to be a Silicon Valley or every part of a country is going to be a Kendall Square. We need to understand where people are, meet people where they are today, and provide that uplift in that particular region, specialized for that particular region. Which is why I will say, Chad, that, you know, answering the question of what's the metric for success, right? That's a hard question to answer in this context, because the metric for success is going to be highly variable depending upon where your starting point is and depending upon where you're trying to go from that starting point. But I will say the following, right? And Thom made a great point. At the end of the day, we're on the and science part of the CHIPS and Science Act, and so we can have a great vision. We can have great ideas for programmatics and put those out there. But at the end of the day, it's going to require the resourcing to really be able to attain that vision. And we'll see what happens over the next few weeks and beyond as we think about that too. But at the end of the day, for us, success. I look at success 5 years out. I don't look at success 6 months out or a year out. I look at success 5 years out. And the question that I would ask is, and this is where maybe it becomes a little parochial, but I think it's important to think about it a little bit that way, because that is what led to the genesis of the CHIPS and Science Act in the first place, which is, what is the narrative around US competitiveness 5 years from now? Today, there's, you know, if you ask many of us in this room, there's concern. Or at least 6 months ago, 9 months ago, prior to the passage of many of these pieces of legislation, there was concern about how the U.S. was faring relative to other nations, relative to some of the competitors on the baseball diamond, if you will. And so, to keep using that analogy. And so for me, success is 5 years from now, is that narrative changing? Because if that narrative is changing 5 years from now, then the investments that we're making through TIP, the investments that we're making through ARPA-H, the investments that we're making through the federal enterprise collectively, working together with the private sector, working together with our national labs, working together with institutions of higher education and the full cross-section of institutions of higher education as well, it will mean that we are actively delivering on what our original vision and goal and ambition was. And then it's about sustaining that as we look to the future as well.
Well, Erwin, I love the idea of the narrative. You know, Deborah mentioned the birth of the Council in 1986. The narrative then was the United States was losing to Japan Incorporated. It was losing to the West German export engine. and had no future path for high quality goods and services. That's why we were born. So I'd like to ask, in the few remaining moments that we have, my fellow panelists, as we look to 2023 and beyond, what is an element of this new narrative that we want to have for the United States? What do you think is one of the most important things that we must, as a council, focus on to ensure, to Erwin's point, 5 years from now, we will be on a path for greater productivity, economic growth, and at the end of the day, inclusive prosperity for every American? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in first. It's a tough one to go, but.
I'll go.
Go.
So very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, from a higher education point of view, when we think about the intersectional partnerships that all of my fellow panelists have described, including the introduction of the community college and technical school potential, I would say we also need to be looking even further upstream and thinking about K through 12. And that's an ongoing conversation. It's certainly not new, but what it means in terms of education, internship, applied experience, broadly demystification of STEM in order to create even an appetite to enter the pathway towards it. And I think that's an all hands on deck proposition.
I would add that I would love to see part of the narrative that our competitiveness is not despite our diversity, it is because of our diversity, bridging on your comments, and a national recognition that nothing hard is done alone. Yeah. And I mean alone, not just individuals, but organizations and constituent groups, that nothing hard is done alone, and so we need to be in it together.
Yeah, I think in terms of this narrative in 5 years, one of the things that I hope I see is that, right now and for a long time, we have seen a lot of other countries saying, well, what did the Americans do?
Right.
And what do we need to do to emulate that and catch up? And of course, in order for that to continue to be true, we have to change what we're doing to respond to the new conditions. And I hope 5 years from now, others are looking at us saying, wow, look what they just did. Now we've got to try and emulate it, because that says, we skated to where the puck was going to be, to continue the sports analogies.
Deborah, any thoughts?
I would just add that at the end of the day, from all the investment and the partnerships and engagement of people, we want to create new value. We want to increase our productivity, but we want to produce the new goods and services that compete globally. And one of the things that we need to do is to continue to accelerate this technology commercialization in a scale-up way. And I'm looking at colleagues that have heard me say this over the years. I hope before my career's over, I don't have to hear the word about the valley of death and how many companies we start that never reach their fruition because we don't have the integration of our capital system with all the ideas and opportunities coming out from this great entrepreneurial culture and investment we have. And we're going to work on that in the council, and I think everybody is going to contribute to this agenda going forward.
Thanks, Deborah. Erwin, I do want to turn to you because you've heard from our board where they want our narrative to be. How can the U.S. Council engage and be helpful with the National Science Foundation? What would be your call to action to this group to, yes, shape our narrative for the future, but also for the country?
My call to action, if I were to say it, would get me in trouble. So I'll say the following instead. I'll say that CHIPS and Science is an authorizing piece of legislation. And at the end of the day, it takes appropriations to really deliver on that vision and that mission. But I'm going to say one other thing too, which is, many people have used this analogy. I'm not the first person to use this. Every generation has its equivalent of a Sputnik moment. This is our equivalent of a Sputnik moment in many ways. We woke up one morning and we saw what we were faced with when it came to semiconductors and supply chains, and failure to do some of the things that we've talked about on this panel today, failure to act in a meaningful way, to democratize, to harness the geography of innovation, to really focus in on place-based innovation, to really focus in on advanced technologies, and thinking about how those technologies can meet societal and economic challenges that we face today. Failure to do that well this time risks us waking up one morning and saying the same thing about every single one of these technology areas that we've talked about. And not only that, I think that there's so much attention to this. There's so much excitement around what's transpired over the course of the last year or so in terms of legislation and so forth. Everywhere I go, I talk about TIP. There's a tremendous amount of energy around that. Failure to really deliver now risks our ability to be able to do something like this again in the future. And so I don't mean to be a pessimist,
No.
right? But I'm saying that to simply say that I think it really is an all hands on deck moment and opportunity for us. And if we seize this opportunity, imagine the possibilities.
Well, Erwin, that's an incredibly important point because, there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of competition for attention. This actually came up at my dinner table last night because you're right, this is a Sputnik moment, but are we selling that? Is America understanding that? And I'm curious what our panel thinks about that. Is there something more that we can do as a council to really emphasize this particularly distinctive moment that we're not already doing? Jan,
Yeah, there's enormous opportunity to put a megaphone to this conversation that is not understood, I believe, it's understood in parts of the business community, but huge parts of the business community where I don't think they would acknowledge this as the moment that we've highlighted here. So I think there's enormous opportunity for us to do that.
Los Alamos is a national security lab. And I would say, do people understand the importance of this moment? Certainly, yes, in the national security space.
Right.
I mean, it's not often in the past that I had people coming up to me asking me what is a low-yield nuclear weapon. Well, that happens now. I would say the thing that we maybe haven't fully connected the dots on in the public discourse is the linkage between the kind of fraught national security environment we have and the scientific and technological competition that we face, because they are very tightly intertwined, and that's less obvious. It does require more explaining.
Joan, I don't know if you want to.
And speaking only for the higher ed community that I serve, although with some sensibility of what's happening across the country, I would say yes and no, much like my colleagues have. I would say that on campus and within the campus communities, people are very aware and engaged, although they may not see necessarily their individual role in being part of the solution. Mm-hmm. But the stakeholders that we serve, not so much. And that it can, to the extent that it can be troubling, their absence of awareness or concern, actually.
Deborah?
I just say that in addition to what we're doing here in Washington with the federal government, with Congress, with the administration, we need to really work with the governors, with the mayors, where we all live, and to bring them in to this whole challenge of our future competitiveness. And the council, I'll mention this towards the end of the day, we're going to be moving out very aggressively now that we're kind of free from lockdowns, knock on wood, to host and convene throughout the country our various initiatives. And so when we do that, we look forward to all of your support to help us build constituencies throughout the country for this very important Sputnik moment.
Erwin, do you want to?
Can I just build on something that you just said, Deborah, which I think is so important? We spend a lot of time when we talk about partnerships and public and private partnerships talking, well, I guess I do because I'm in the federal government, but we spend a lot of time talking about federal level engagement, right? And I can't stress enough the importance of state and local and tribal governmental organizations engaging here as well. When we put out the call for NSF engines and concept outlines for the NSF engines program, we received 679 submissions, right? And to the point of, are we broadening the tent? Those 679 submissions were led by 500 plus organizations, distinct organizations. Of those 500 plus distinct organizations, 40% had not received funding from NSF previously, right? That's moving in the right direction, right? I mean, that's a little bit of signal in the noise, if you will. But at the end of the day, we all know, even in our wildest imaginations of appropriations, we're not going to be able to fund 679 engines across the country. Yet, what I hear from the teams is the amount of energy and excitement at the state and local level, to the point that maybe they can persist, maybe they can get engagement from the state and local and tribal levels, so that even if they're not funded by NSF or Department of Commerce with the regional tech hubs or something, the excitement is there, and that can endure beyond the submission of a proposal, and that can lead to further growth around that particular ecosystem that they're trying to catalyze. And that requires engagement at all levels. It's not just a federal activity. State, local, tribal, governmental organizations also engaging, and of course, the private sector and beyond.
Well, Erwin, I know the council and our community stand ready to work with you and the National Science Foundation in that effort. And as Deborah mentioned last night, in addition to the Great Mountain West Innovation Summit we were able to host this past year, and thank you, Erwin, for being with us with
awesome.
Greg Hill and with Ed Seidel and John Wagner and the teams from across the Midwest. We will be at Davis, California, March 27th and 28th, so folks, please mark your calendar. I think we'll have many more announcements of where the council will be across this great country in 2023 and beyond. And with that, I want to thank this panel for opening up the NCF, and we look forward to the rest of the conversation.